This video was brought to you by Ground News. Is the UK on the verge of entering a recession? It's a question that continually plagues policymakers, and one that in recent weeks has filtered through to the ordinary man and woman on the street. At the end of last year, the Bank of England was warning that the UK would indeed be in recession throughout 2023 and the first half of 2024, warning of economic turbulence to come. So far, however, the UK has avoided recession. So the question is why? Why has the UK seemingly managed to avoid recession so far, and can it last? Spoiler, probably not. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. As we see it, there are broadly three reasons why the UK has managed to avoid a recession so far: consumer resilience, government intervention, and pure luck. The last two go somewhat together, so let's start there. One of the main issues that was dragging the UK economy down last year was energy prices. The war in Ukraine, coupled with economies reopening post-COVID, drove up electricity and gas prices across Europe, with the UK particularly hit. Part of the impact of those rises was mitigated by government intervention, in the form of the Energy Price Guarantee and the Energy Bills Support Scheme. Through this intervention, prices were effectively capped, with the government also providing a further one-time discount of £400 on energy bills. The problem here being that this support was for consumers, i.e. households and not businesses. While some support was put into place for commercial consumers, businesses had to bear the brunt of high energy prices largely on their own, which is where pure luck comes into play too. The UK and much of Europe had an exceptionally warm winter, which meant that energy stores weren't run down anywhere near as low as expected. And this has led to energy prices falling from their lofty heights, lessening the pressure on businesses and households, and ultimately meaning that the former were able to survive. Government intervention was also of use in other areas too, such as benefits and pensions. While public sector pay is subject to negotiation between government and civil servants, pension awards and benefit entitlements tend to be automatically uprated by inflation, something that's helped prop up household budgets for a significant subsection of society. And this is where the third factor comes in: consumer resilience. In spite of pressure on household budgets, consumers have been remarkably resilient when it comes to day-to-day spending. Consumer-facing services expenditure, i.e. spending in restaurants and shops, actually grew by 1% in April. None of this is to say that the UK economy has been or is in an excellent position though. After all, inflation is still incredibly high, and the economy only grew in April by 0.2%. After a fall of 0.3% in March. It's nonetheless notable, though, that in spite of predictions otherwise, a recession has been avoided. So, can this last? Will the UK be able to avoid a recession despite the economic headwinds? Well, it all really depends on inflation, which has remained stubbornly high. Last month, for example, official figures showed inflation stayed flat at 8.7%. Significantly higher than the 8.4% that the bank and economists were expecting. To bring down this inflation, the Bank of England had to raise interest rates faster than expected. Earlier this month, the bank hiked the base rate by 50 basis points to 5%, instead of the 25 basis points that most analysts were expecting. As such, if this inflation persists and interest rates continue to rise, then things will get difficult for the government. Analysts predict that if rates reach 6%, a recession is basically guaranteed. And unfortunately for ordinary Brits, if we take a look at where interest rates are heading, it's looking ever more likely that the 6% level will be breached, with mortgage rates over a week ago already pricing in further hikes for this year. And on the latest indications, markets now see a 70% chance of rates breaching 6% by year end. Ultimately, this is because disinflation, i.e. reducing the rate of inflation, is what economists sometimes euphemistically describe as costly. To reduce inflation, you have to pour cold water on the economy, which usually means higher unemployment and lower consumer spending, which obviously runs the risk of a recession. By increasing interest rates, the theory goes that the reward for saving and the cost of borrowing increases, which means that individuals and companies are incentivized to spend less, or are forced to in order to cover existing debts. Take mortgages, for example. If your mortgage has gone up by £200 a month, you're probably going to have to cut back on how much you go out, which should, in theory, cool down the economy and bring down inflation. Now, that doesn't sound all that fun, but it's ultimately why Sunak has been so reluctant to provide support to mortgage holders. Sure, it's squeezing their wallets, but that's basically the whole point of interest rate rises. When describing the impact of interest rates and inflation on the wider economy, economists often talk about the sacrifice ratio, i.e. the ratio between a 1% rate-induced drop in inflation and the corresponding negative impact on GDP. Now, there's no single sacrifice ratio, but recent estimates put it in the region of 3 or 4, i.e. reducing inflation by 1% leads to a 3 or 4% cumulative loss in output. Now, obviously, it depends how quickly you work to squeeze inflation out of the economy. But the key takeaway is that by bringing inflation down by 8.7% today to the bank's stated target of 2% would be immensely painful. And according to the sacrifice ratio, require a contraction of between 20 and 25%. And ultimately, that's why analysts are generally quite gloomy about the UK's ability to avoid a recession in the medium term. Analysis by Bloomberg Economics predicts that the Bank of England will be forced to tip the UK into recession by the end of the year, largely because they expect the bank to raise interest rates further in order to bring down inflation. And that, quote, "In a world where the Bank of England followed market expectations, we would expect the economy to be about 1% smaller by Q4 of 2025, with a deeper recession." But there is a glimmer of hope for the UK. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that inflation isn't entirely within our control, and it's largely determined by global factors. The recent bout of inflation, for example, has mainly been driven by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So there's always the chance that global factors save the day somehow, that global food or energy prices fall steeply, for example. But to bank on that is a bit of a long shot. Ultimately, though, things don't look great, and the base case is the UK will enter a year-long recession towards the tail end of this year, which is yet more bad news for an already embattled Rishi Sunak. Now, this kind of economic stuff is always difficult to predict, and it's really complex and nuanced. And as such, our goal at TLDR has always been to shed some light on these stories to help you better understand what's going on in the world around you. Unfortunately, though, many news outlets use this complexity and nuance to frame a story in a certain way, which is why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a really useful website and app which I use every day, which lets you compare related articles in one place from thousands of sources around the world and across the political spectrum, with context about each and every source of information. For instance, take this story about the potential economic collapse of Thames Water. Ground News allows me to see which outlets are reporting on this most. In this case, only 25% of articles come from right-leaning outlets. It also allows me to compare headlines and stories by outlet, allowing me to get a fuller picture of what's really happening. And if I want to dive deeper into one of these reports, I can be taken to the story with just one tap, with Ground also providing reporting accuracy and bias scores for each outlet. Now, I have Ground on my phone's home screen, and I genuinely can't recommend them enough. So because of this, we've decided to offer a special 30% discount for Ground's Vantage subscription. And you can only access that discount by clicking the link down below. So check it out and help support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.